You can take a guess.
I would guess like maybe depression and anxiety.
Yep, depression, anxiety are very common. PTSD can be, but that's more rare, so
Sure.
it tends to be depression, anxiety, sometimes, and bipolar as well. And so depression can be caused by chemical use because when people use drugs, it blocks the high is actually endorphins being released like they would be for anything else, like when you're excited or happy. The difference is that the drugs block the receptors that would put them back into storage, so they essentially just kind of prolong that high, and your brain in a sort of survival mode realizes that there's something not normal. So it realizes that there's too many endorphins and it thinks that it made too many. And so what does it start to do? Not make as much. All right? And then that person gets high again. And the brain goes, whoa, I made too much. It's still too much. I need to make even less. And so what happens is after any sort of, or what can happen, any sort of prolonged drug use or regular usage, your brain will start to make less and less endorphins, which, guess what, after a certain period of time, is actually clinical depression, right? When you hear about depression being a chemical imbalance in the brain, that a person's brain isn't making enough serotonin or dopamine, the drug use can actually be what caused that. Does that make sense for people? So with co-occurring conditions, a lot of times doctors will ask questions to try to see which one came first, but that can happen pretty quickly, and so sometimes it's really difficult to be able to tell. Let's see here. You talked about how people with mental illnesses can be more susceptible or more likely to use and abuse substances. Do you have any explanation as to why that might be, or any explanations to that one?
Sure. So mental illnesses, a lot of times they affect someone's mood and things like that, and so drugs are seen as kind of a release and a way to cope with it. And a lot of times, if you are having a mental illness and stuff, you kind of overdo it, and so then it leads to an addiction and things like that, where you actually are dependent upon that to find whether it's happiness or just relief from this mental illness that you're experiencing.
And Ms. Franklin said that if you're depressed, some people might drink alcohol, for instance, to kind of make that go away, but alcohol is also a depressant, so then you get more depressed, and then it's a cycle.
Yep. Alcohol also causes anxiety. Obviously, it's a depressant, so not when the person is using it, but typically within 24 hours, it actually increases anxiety. So alcohol is also really common with people who have anxiety disorder, because they want to just sort of chill out or calm down, which alcohol as a depressant has that immediate effect, but then it actually increases their anxiety the next day typically. So that's also a really double-edged sword and ends up making it worse. But yeah, so it's that idea of self-medicating, right? Of wanting to check out, of wanting to maybe feel nothing. That feeling nothing feels better than feeling, if they're depressed, sort of that pain or sadness or anger that they are dealing with. So it's that idea of them self-medicating. And if you know somebody who's been diagnosed with mental illness and they are on medication, drugs and alcohol can actually negate the effects of the medication. So it's a really, really bad idea, if they're taking antidepressants, for them to drink or use drugs. It essentially wipes out the positive effects of the antidepressants. So, and anti-anxiety medication or whatever it happens for them to be on. So, yeah, I think the therapist that you guys answered was a really important point to make. What do you feel that Eastview could do better to give more support or increase awareness for the things you guys researched?
Sure. So mental illness is kind of briefly addressed in Wellness 2 and stuff like that, but it doesn't really go into that much detail. I don't really remember the unit even from it. So maybe just like what one of our solution was having a wellness class that's specifically dedicated to wellness or to mental health and stuff like that, because just being aware, and if you do have knowledge on it and going, oh, this is happening to me, and then you can go and get help. And not only that, but a lot of times kids are really perceptive and stuff like that, so if they see some of these symptoms happening with their parents and stuff like that, they can kind of get them help too, so it kind of reaches a broader group of people than just the kids and stuff like that are going through the course. So
I think we could do better, like if we had a more loving culture where we kind of cared about each other more, we would look out for each other and the issues that we have internally and externally.
Good. What are your recommendations as far as if somebody's concerned about themselves or somebody else, speaking of looking out for each other, for either mental illness or addiction issue? I'm concerned about a friend of mine, what maybe started out as something that I just thought was a phase or that they would, sort of work through. It's been a couple months now or whatever, and they're still, it's either gotten worse or it's still the same. What would you guys recommend that I do?
Well, there are some identification, like quizzes or tests online that you can take to see if you may be at risk. They're not a formal doctor, but it's a good indication if maybe you might want to see one. And then after taking that test and you might be at risk, you might want to talk to a doctor, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
yeah, and like even if you have that shred of a doubt in your mind, I think it's always better to go and seek help and stuff like that, because it's better for the doctor to come back and be like, no, they don't have a mental illness or something like that, rather than them actually having it and not being treated for it then. So
Yeah, I've had a couple of students who, and that's kind of my advice too, is like, let's let the doctor decide, like they're the professional. It doesn't hurt you at all to go see them and share sort of what your experience has been lately. And I've had a couple of students who have been diagnosed with mono, because mono actually presents very, very similar symptoms to depression. And so they were able to get treated for that. And then obviously I've had many, many students be diagnosed with a mental illness, so that they could start treatment with that. And your regular doctor is a good, if you have a good relationship with your normal doctor, that would be an easy person to start with. You can also go talk to the counselors here. They can ask some of the sort of those same identifying questions that you can find online, and everything you talk to with them is confidential. All right, unless you threaten to hurt yourself or someone else, or someone is threatened to hurt you, then they have to tell your parents. But everything else is considered confidential, and they don't have to tell anybody about. And I just had a student meet with a counselor a couple of weeks ago, and I just kind of said, I think this might be happening based on the questions that I asked. I thought it sounds like you might be depressed. You felt this way for a really long time. It hasn't gotten better on its own. If it is a mental illness, it won't get better on its own. So how about you just talk to a counselor and let them tell you if they think you should see a doctor or not. And it was absolutely, the counselor thought, yeah, this person is definitely dealing with some depression. They saw their doctor. And now they are getting medication, and hopefully things will start to get better in the near future for them. So, it really is about reaching out and talking to somebody. And with the counselors, if you're worried about someone, you can make an appointment with that person. You can say, hey, I'll go with you to this appointment with the counselor. Or you can actually just tell a counselor, like, maybe you know somebody's cutting or something, right? And nobody knows. You can make an anonymous tip to a counselor. You can say, because counselors, as you guys know, you've probably all been called down for a random reason, like a check-in, how's your year going? Let's take a look at your requirements, make sure you're on track for graduation. Like, there's a bazillion reasons a counselor can call you down, and they'll have that exact same conversation with that person. But hopefully, if they know that something's going on with that person, they can press a little bit harder, sort of like, well, how are you really doing? What struggles, what things have been tough for you this year? What challenges are you going through? And then hopefully that leads to a bigger conversation. They don't ever have to drop your name or say that anybody told them anything. They do this all the time, and they're pretty dang good at it. So You know, use the resources here at school. We actually have a therapist at school, you guys. How many of you knew that we had a licensed therapist that comes to school? All right, so less than half of you even knew that. So you can actually get, this is great for people, as you guys brought up, folks that can't afford certain things and stuff, like maybe they don't have transportation to go see a therapist. When they come to school, once a week, they can have an appointment to see that therapist. What do each of you feel is the most important thing that you learned? Because we learned a little bit about it. We could talk. In college they have entire semester classes about mental health. So obviously there's a lot more that we'd love to talk about, but you have to narrow it down in wellness too. So you had a little bit of background on this topic. What's the most important thing that you felt that you learned when you started digging in deeper?
For me, I learned a lot about how actually widespread these issues are, where it might seem like they're really small. It's almost like it's more common to have one of them, it may seem like, than to not.
For me, going into it thought it was like you have mental illness and then you turn to like substances, but it can also be the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off what Ray said,